Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, you Insider Indianapolis Star. It's Wednesday night. I'm assuming you'll hear this on Thursday unless you're watching on YouTube, because we'll probably post this on YouTube tonight. But it is Wednesday night, September 18th, and this is Mind Your Banners. I told you we'd probably have a second episode this week. What do we call them? Podcast episodes? Are they episodes?
They are episodes, yes.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know if we got a new word for them. That is Galen Clavio sipping on something tasty looking at the other end of the screen of CrimsonCast. Sometimes with this parish, we have Galen on whenever we want to up the classiness of the podcast, and we thought we'd do that tonight because Indiana is 3-0. Indiana is receiving votes in both polls, and it is fair to say that not very quietly, Galen, Indiana is kind of on people's minds. The national media, the national consciousness has woken up and taken some interest in Indiana. And I know that we spend a lot of time at this podcast talking about, writing about, thinking about IU football, but it's good sometimes to get a perspective maybe that is outside of sort of the tunnel that you tend to build around yourself when you're working a beat. So I want to start with this because I know you were at the game on Saturday, and I'm sure the Rose Bowl was a cool experience. I was bummed I could not go. Um, but at least from the television broadcast, you could tell there are quite a number of Indiana fans there. Um, what was, I guess, basically the vibe in the stadium as that game wore on? Because once you're allowed to, obviously in the moment, you're always going to feel a certain sense of peril when you watch your team play sports. But I think it is fair to say that in the cold sort of light of hindsight, that game was really only ever going one way.
Yeah, it was so much fun from an IU fan perspective. And, whether it was 80-20 UCLA fans or 70-30 UCLA fans, there were far more UCLA fans than IU fans. But the energy from the IU fans in the stadium was among very few other experiences I've had as an IU fan in a traveling circumstance. And I think that the way that the pregame laid out, there were so many IU fans in Pasadena. There was a huge IU Alumni Association tailgate before the game. There were like 1,200 people. There was a ticketed event that sold out. Um, and the people there, it was this fascinating mix. There were young fans. There were, people that were currently in college, but there were also people that had graduated in the 70s or graduated in the 60s. It was this fascinating cross culture of IU fans, and everybody was excited. Everybody was a little nervous going in. And as the game wore on, yeah, you look at it in retrospect, it's like I don't think Indiana's win probability ever dropped below 80% once you got out of the first quarter. But you're always kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop as an IU football fan. And we've seen instance after instance of the other shoe dropping, and it just never did. And as the game wore on, when they scored that touchdown, I think to make it 35-13, I left my seat and ran up into the section that had the most IU fans and just started randomly high-fiving people. It just felt like the thing to do. And all the rest of the IU fans started congregating around the tunnel, cheering on the players as they left the field. It was just such a joyous vibe, which is not an emotion that we normally attach to going to watch IU football games, especially on the road. And I think it was a combination. Like there was a huge psychological weight that felt like it was lifted from a lot of older fans, and I include myself in that category now, because of the fact that it was the Rose Bowl. It wasn't the Rose Bowl game, but it was in the Rose Bowl, which has always had this kind of like forbidden landscape aspect to it for IU to go on the road to play as well as they did and to really demonstrate like yes, the first two games were against lesser competition, but this was a live game against a Big Ten opponent, one that was, expected to win this game before the season, and they really just beat the heck out of them throughout the course of the game. It was really invigorating, and it just felt like a professional football performance from an IU program that we just haven't seen a whole lot of that out of lately.
I guess I want to talk about to fit this in the context because what's struck me is we spent all off season, really kind of from the moment. And I don't want to act like everyone has done literally everything right every minute of the day since, the final whistle of the bucket game last November. But really from like the morning that the Sunday morning when Indiana fired Tom Allen, it has seemed like whoever was making them got a lot of the big calls right. I thought, for example, it kind of went under the radar of just the excitement of a coaching search, the interest of coaching search. But I thought, for example, it was probably a good thing that Indiana and Tom Allen came to some sort of agreement that just kind of, lowered his buyout, but basically paid him everything within a couple months and just, a clean break. Um, there was a Indiana really made an effort to pair NIL fundraising with the coaching search and really kind of make it clear to its fan base that those two things had to kind of exist in partnership to one another. One could not be successful without the other, and vice versa. Obviously, Curt Cignetti's hiring, the buzz around that, the staffing that Curt Cignetti was able to execute in a pretty short space of time, the portal work, the spring season. There was just a feeling kind of through the offseason that you just sort of kept saying to yourself, Indiana's doing what seems to be the right thing. But we all pretty consistently said, um, you know, none of this matters until it is sort of manifested in wins. And, time's going to tell us what these teams that Indiana's beating are this season. I actually suspect UCLA may not be terribly less talented than Indiana, but I don't think it's necessarily as well coached as Indiana. And I also think it's basically gotten whatever the bad karma in the yang to Indiana's scheduling yin this season. If you look at UCLA's schedule, it is awfully unforgiving. It looks like the Panthers having to play the Saints a lot, basically. My point is, what has struck me is the way Indiana has been able to carry this forward. And I think a lot of that has been Curt Cignetti. I think a lot of it has been hiring someone who was a longtime head coach with a proven track record of experience and how you pull all this stuff together. But it just that at every turn, all the way up to and this weekend felt meaningful because I think it was the game everybody was kind of waiting for. You felt like Indiana should beat Florida International, Indiana should beat Western Illinois. At every turn, you kind of kept waiting. You talk about the shoe dropping for IU fans. At every turn, you kind of kept waiting for something to go wrong, somebody to get hurt, something to not work out. The first choice defensive coordinator to go somewhere else, whatever. And it just never really has. And that's not to say Indiana is going to go 15-0 this season. They're obviously going to lose some football games, but it I guess just from your perspective, just what's it like watching a program that finally has some momentum in its hands and seems to be doing the right thing with it, essentially.
I think I said on CrimsonCast this week, I don't know what to do with all this competence. I don't know how to react to it. There's a little bit of a feeling similar to the 2019 season when everything just kind of broke right. Like they hired the right offensive coordinator and the defensive coordinator really started coming into his own. And you had two good quarterbacks and you had a really good scheme and you had a defense that played pretty well. And a couple of things went right early and that kind of just it rolled down the hill in a way where Indiana won 8 games, should have won 9. We haven't had a whole lot of seasons like that in IU football history. And to watch everything come together the way it has so far through the offseason and through fall camp, when we were doing our preseason podcasts, both Scott and I predicted 8-4, and people are like, "Oh, a bit too optimistic there. You better temper the expectations." But it really did feel like, from what we were hearing from Cignetti and from his staff, the way that they were operating and acting, from what we were hearing from players, both through official and unofficial channels about, I heard more than once from players like, we loved Coach Allen as a person, but we really feel so much more prepared in the details now than we did before. And I think, IU is a program, and I've been saying this, you've heard me say it before multiple times, like IU really needs not an emotional leader, but they need a really solid logistical coach who can do the little things well. And a lot of times programs that don't have a ton of talent have been able to win far above the amount of games that you would expect them to win because they don't beat themselves. They don't let themselves get down when things don't go their way, and they do the little things right. I think Iowa has built an entire program with Kirk Ferentz around that approach. I think Virginia Tech was like that for many years with Frank Beamer. And Iowa's been defense focused, and Virginia Tech was special teams focused. And with IU right now, what it just feels like is this is a team that's really well drilled, and they don't get in their own brains too negatively when things don't go their way. That sequence at the end of the first half and the beginning of the second half in that UCLA game, when UCLA drives down the field, scores a touchdown right before half. They get the ball back. They drive down the field again. They get first and goal. And I guarantee most of the IU fans who had any experience with the program were sitting there thinking, oh, God, here we go. Like, this is when the wheels start to fall off. But instead, they hold them to a field goal, and then they go right back out, and they drive down the field, and they score a touchdown. And now it's 28-10. And now you feel good all of a sudden. I've been so impressed with this team and their ability to just do what they plan on doing, and they're going to try to do it to the best of their ability. And to me, that all springs from the coach and his staff. I think Scott Dolson deserves a ton of credit for figuring out that this was the guy that he wanted, bringing him in, putting the resources around him. But I also think this coach and his staff deserve a huge amount of credit for going out and finding guys who, A, could play at this level when a lot of people question the transfers that were coming in, and B, have managed to make them almost like an interchangeable unit on both sides of the ball, offense and defense, where you've got 4 legitimate running backs, you've got 6 or 7 legitimate receivers, and they're all surrounding a quarterback that, I mean, he was at Ohio, he was injured. There was a lot of forethought there on the part of the staff, figuring out that they could use him and putting him in a position to succeed. He's been incredibly impressive. And on defense, they've put together a lot of great pieces. There's a lot more season to play, but I've watched enough IU football to feel like what I'm seeing out of this team, there is a level of competence, there's a level of confidence, and there's a game plan, the likes of which we don't see very much in IU football. And that, to me, as a long-time observer of this program, is really gratifying.
I'm also struck, and I don't just want to talk about what life was like 9 months ago or whatever. But I'm also struck by, I'm while you were talking there, I was trying to go back through and, look at the hiring grades that people put together. And all I really remember is Curt Cignetti getting a lot of A minus, that kind of thing. I can remember talking to people in my side of college football, sort of the media side of it, who were really impressed with the way Indiana was able to get Cignetti, the NIL commitments, how swiftly they moved, all these kinds of things. Obviously, there was the moment in Assembly Hall. I can't even remember. Was it the Maryland game? Were they playing Maryland? No, it wasn't. It was a bye game. But anyway, when he gets on the,
I think it was the Maryland game.
Was it the Maryland game?
I was in Hawaii at the time. I remember hearing about this. Like, Cignetti made the crowd go crazy. So
yeah, but I remember there being sort of this outward sort of, hey, actually, it seems like Indiana's kind of doing the grown-up thing here, the competent thing here. But then the thing that actually struck me from that time period, again, with the benefit of hindsight, and I don't know if you heard Cignetti explain, if you heard his explanation for why he did that. Somebody asked him about it at Big Ten Media Day. And I don't know if you heard this, but he said basically he spent the whole day meeting people at IU. And I don't think he just meant players. I think he meant employees, staff, fans, whatever. And everybody kind of kept coming up to him and saying, love to win the bucket next year, would love to go to a bowl game next year, whatever. And he said, I don't normally kind of do that very often. I think increasingly, I'm not sure I totally believe him. But he said, I just felt like I needed to kind of send a message that it was okay to aim higher. And it seems like, as much as anything else, I remember when Kevin Wilson came in, and obviously it's a different time and place in IU football history, and frankly, college football history. It takes Kevin 5 years to get to a bowl. It probably should have only taken 3. They probably should have won that Minnesota game in 2013. There were a couple other games that, arguably they should have won. The point is, I think we contextualize Kevin's tenure very differently, basically, if they just finish that drive against Minnesota and win that game. But Kevin kind of said some of the same things. Indiana was just coming at it from a different place. I think Curt Cignetti, the other interesting thing he said that I'm not sure how many people picked up on at Media Day was, he said, I got to Indiana And all anybody could tell me is you can't win in Indiana. And yet 3 years ago, Indiana was one score away from playing for a Big Ten title. So clearly you must be able to win in Indiana. It seems like if you could kind of boil down, like if you ask me to reduce everything Kurt Signetti has sort of like said and has seemed to try and drum into his program, whether that's his players, his I don't think his coaches have any problem with this because so many of them know him so well. But his players, his fans, his administration, whoever, there's no reason to limit your ambitions. And I don't think, man, listen, I don't think Tom Allen did that, and I don't think Kevin Wilson did that. But I think there's something about Signetti's approach, which is probably the same thing that has led him to have a winning record wherever he's been, that has gotten that across in a way that, I mean, you talk about like the competence and like the professionalism in a performance like UCLA, where it doesn't feel like it's not, I don't say it doesn't feel like it's by accident. You're seeing Indiana winning because Indiana's just playing well, and Indiana believes in itself. Indiana is riding the confidence that it is earning with the way that it's performing. And it all kind of stems back to this root message, which is there's no reason for us to sit around here and think of reasons why we can't do this.
Yeah.
There's every reason for us to simply look at this process, recognize the results it's yielded in the past at other places, and see that we can. And again, they've won 3 games. We're not putting them in the playoff. I'm not, Signetti's not coach of the year. They're not, I'm not suggesting he's going in the Big Ten Hall of Fame someday. There's a lot left to prove, a lot left to achieve, but I don't think it's anyone's getting out over their skis looking at, and I think the UCLA game, because again, that was the game people kind of targeted in the preseason, win that game and it proves something. That was kind of everyone's, sort of bat signal to say, okay, all this stuff that he talked about, this picture he painted, now it is clarifying.
Yeah, so I think the rhetoric is important because I believe very strongly that you have to build confidence in your football team in order to have success. Unconfident football teams at any level generally don't win. And you have to be able to project that to your players. They have to buy into it. It can't be fake. It can't be just sloganeering. There has to be some substance behind it. And so, that's one big aspect of Signetti's approach that is certainly successful. But I think, where we can actually make it a little bit simpler than that. The most successful coach that IU had post World War II was Bill Mallory. Bill Mallory had a ton of head coach experience at the college level before he got to Indiana. He was the head coach at Colorado. He was the head coach at Northern Illinois. He won at both places, and he knew how to set up a program and get results. And he took over a program that was in pretty bad shape talent-wise, and within 3 years had them in a bowl game. Signetti has a similar profile, not at as high of a level, but this is a guy that's been a head coach now for quite a while, and he did that on purpose, leaving Alabama, because I think he realized he needed to get that kind of experience to be able to have the success that he wanted before he retired. And I think the big difference in my eyes between him and any of the coaches that Indiana had essentially that led up to that point, especially Kevin Wilson and Tom Allen, is that both Kevin Wilson and Tom Allen were first-year head coaches. They had never been a head coach at that level before. They didn't have a staff that they brought with them. They were still working out their processes. And from having covered both of them, like there were things that occurred in both of their tenures that, Wilson kind of at the beginning, and I think Allen more towards the end, that looked a lot like someone struggling in their first full-time head coaching position and trying to like figure out all the things that need to be done. And I think that's been the biggest change for me is like, it's clear from the moment that Signetti and his staff got on campus that they drilled these guys in fundamentals. They went out and found people who could execute and who could learn. And it's easy to say that. It's quite another thing to actually execute it on a regular basis. And what I think the stat that I'm the most impressed by from Indiana so far, and yes, you take the opposition into account, but they've had 3 games and they've had 0 turnovers. They've turned the ball over 0 times. They've forced turnovers in each of the games that they've played. And, it's just one thing, but it's like limiting mistakes and limiting the situations where you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. has been a key component of what Cignetti has tried to do with this team. I think it's very clear. And so certainly the rhetoric helps, but if it's not backed up with the core components of here's how we're going to play, here's what we do in these situations, we're going to be ready for anything, and we're not going to let ourselves get overly affected one way or another. I think those are really important for a team like Indiana that is not going to out-talent anybody that they play from this point forward, with the possible exception of their opponent this upcoming week against Charlotte.
Yeah, I do want to like cast this forward because I think that the temperature. I mean, if we're talking about taking the temperature of like a fan base or a program's sort of general direction, or however you want to describe that, there is an extent to which it is always only as comfortable as what you do the next week. At least in season, obviously, if you win your bowl game or you win a national title or whatever. But at this time of year, it is really much more defined by kind of what comes next. And I remember saying this during the 2019 season, where people would say, well, what did that win mean? And I said, well, we'll find out next week. Especially during that 4-game win streak, where it's like, well, they beat Maryland and that was a great win, but now they got to go home and not trip up against a bad Rutgers team. Okay, well, now they're 5-3. Well, now they have 2 prime opportunities here to get to 6 wins before the bye week or whatever, before they play Penn State or Michigan. What does this mean? Well, we're only going to find out next week. I think I think it's clear that Charlotte has Curt Cignetti's attention after making life a little bit uncomfortable for North Carolina last weekend. I think we should still be able to assume to some extent that Indiana will win this game. Okay, I don't know. Maybe they won't cover. Maybe Charlotte will do what they did at North Carolina, where it's a 1-score game in the third quarter, and then Indiana pulls it together and finishes. I guess my question for you is like, what is I have an answer to this personally, but I'm curious for yours. What is the next most important game on the schedule from the perspective of the direction of the program, the momentum it has, maybe the buy-in that Cignetti's winning from his fan base? Because we've seen him, kind of, and not like rudely or anything, but pretty clearly sort of call out his fans and say like, this whole thing works completely differently if you're all there. From your perspective, like, what is the next most important step here, other than we can assume not losing this weekend to Charlotte?
Look, the Maryland game is going to be huge. That's Parents Weekend. Parking passes sold out in August for that game. I don't know what the ticket situation looks like, but I would expect 50,000 fans there for that game. I think the UCLA game woke a bunch of people up. And Maryland is the team that Indiana has to be better than historically in the Big Ten. I mean, a lot of that was Big Ten East. It's like, if you're not better than Maryland, you're probably not making a bowl. And that largely proved true most of the time. I think if they can put in a really good showing and beat Maryland at home in front of 50,000 fans, that sets up the middle portion of the schedule incredibly well. Because if you do that, and then you're able to if you can go on the road and beat what looks like a bad Northwestern team, now you're 6-0 going into the bye. You've already achieved bowl eligibility, and the hype builds significantly for a homecoming game against what will almost certainly be a ranked Nebraska team. But to me, if you don't win the Maryland game, I don't know what the crowd's going to look like this week. I would imagine about 45, 46,000. I don't think it's going to be full. It's an opponent that's just not going to draw that many people in, but more people will be there than were there for FIU in Western Illinois. If you can go in and win by 10, 15 points, really be a dominant team in that game against Maryland, I think people will say, okay, they are a serious football team. They are going places. This is a team that we're going to fully throw ourselves behind. And from there, it's really a fascinating runway the rest of the way. But I think to me, like, Maryland's perfect for the picking because, new quarterback, no one's entirely sure what they're going to look like. They already lost at home to Michigan State this season. That's a game that you should win, given how well Indiana's played so far. And I think if they perform well in that game, it really sets up the potential of having 3 or 4 home games immediately after that, where the crowd is similar to those 2021 games, right at the beginning of the season when everybody was hyped and the team unfortunately just didn't perform. The loss to Cincinnati, the loss to Michigan State that kind of ended things that year. That to me is the big fulcrum point game. And from there, it really determines whether you're looking at the sky's the limit or whether you're looking at, well, maybe 7 or 8 wins is the ceiling. Either way, it's far better than I think a lot of people assumed the first year would be. But to me, that's the fulcrum point for this program at this point for this season.
I'll lay it on you. Forgive me, I don't normally do this, but I was made to make a prediction before the season started, and so I will ask you, uh, just very simply, as things stand, and let's assume, a relative degree of luck with health. I'm not asking you what happens if Indiana gets to its fourth string quarterback or something like that. Where do you think the season's going? And with the schedule, with what you've seen so far, acknowledging that there are, tougher tests ahead. Where do you think this season winds up?
I also did predictions at the beginning of the season. I picked 8-4 in the regular season, and I felt good about that. And I honestly even felt like I pulled a punch. And I thought, well, if things break right, I think 9-3 is certainly on the table. I think that realm, for the way that this team is playing, and frankly, Zach, for how weak the schedule is down the stretch, is absolutely doable. I think there's one game on the schedule that is not winnable, and that's the game at Ohio State, and that's fine. I think that's an unwinnable game for almost the entirety of FBS this year. But all of the games, all the teams that we looked at the beginning of the year and said, I don't know if Indiana can win that one. I don't I'm not sold on those teams. Like Nebraska's ranked, and I would challenge anybody, look at what IU has done and what Nebraska has done in their schedules so far, and tell me who has the more impressive resume right now. Nebraska's ranked because there was hype around Nebraska. They're a better brand. They get talked about more, but I think IU's got a better collection of results. Washington, who a lot of people were worried about as, being a team that could bounce right back, they just lost in the Apple Cup to Washington State. I don't think that they're unbeatable, particularly in a game in Memorial Stadium. Michigan just had to change starting quarterbacks in week 3. That's generally a harbinger that things aren't going well for you. And you look at the rest of the games, I don't think Indiana's going to win all of them. And I think they'll drop a game or two that we'll look back on and say, well, that was disappointing. But, you go down the list, and unless there's injury or catastrophic issues with the team that we're not seeing right now, they could play around the same level that they've played up to this point, and I think somewhat coast to 8 wins, just given the competition that they'll be facing.
It's funny. I actually I pulled a punch a little bit too. I wanted to well, not wanted to, but I got to 9 wins as well, and then I felt like I was maybe giving Indiana more credit than at the very least they'd earned. So I took the cheaters way out, and I picked them to win 8 games, and then just sort of randomly just said they would win their bowl game. But I find it hard to argue with that logic. I mean, the Michigan one is the one where I do think back to 2019, and I remind people that, like, football teams get better as seasons go on. If IU fans who maybe don't remember, and listen, I'm not suggesting don't dream of beating Michigan, but that Michigan team did not look good the first 3, 4, 5 weeks of the season, and Indiana kind of got on a roll, and it was like, oh man, Indiana could beat Michigan. And then, like, by the time they got to Bloomington, Michigan had pulled it together and was just dominant on both lines of scrimmage, and it was fine. Like, there was nothing wrong with it. Indiana beat Purdue the next week. They went to the Gator Bowl. Like, there was no harm, no foul really on the season. But I do broadly agree. I look around, and I mean, I picked Indiana. I think I picked them to beat Nebraska, which to me is a bit of a coin toss game as things stand. But on the other hand, I picked them to lose to Northwestern, which I don't feel quite as good about now. Although that's always a game that can be affected by weather. That's always one of those games where it could be 45 and raining, and there's wind off the lake, and nobody can throw the ball. But I'm with you in the sense that, some of it is the schedule. It feels like Indiana has kind of cashed in all of its, like, 10 years worth of chips.
With the big stack. It was a big stack.
Well, they got a good schedule. Deshaun Foster's looking at Indiana's schedule and wondering when he joins that Big Ten.
Yeah, as a former resident of the Big Ten East, I have zero sympathy for Deshaun at this point.
But it's going to be fascinating, and I really do appreciate you coming on, because like I said, it is easy for us to, get locked into our Monday this, Tuesday this, Saturday this, just kind of roll of the season, and grouse about being up in Chicago for an entire week for both basketball media days and then the Northwestern game, and wonder if we're going to have a bowl game to fit in around that trip to the Palestra on January 5th. And we lose some perspective. So thank you, Galen, for joining us, and thank you all for listening. He's Galen Clavio, Crimson Cast. I think you all know this by this point. But Crimson Cast, wherever you get your podcasts, like including possibly the app you're literally listening to this one on right now. But he is Galen Clavio. I'm Zach Osterman. This has been Mind Your Banners for September 18th, 2024. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you soon.